avoidance of certain places would be to confront that very scene. Now, if a life-threatening event occurred in a place that you must revisit, an elevator if you live on the 20th floor, a classroom if something happened in school, and you are going to have to go back to school, then some desensitization to that site is important. And we're finding now that the strategies for helping people overcome these fears are not too different from the strategies that work for people who are agoraphobic, including kids. So there are a range of approaches. Some of them deal with tolerating a very, very anxiety-provoking scene until you live through your anxiety. In other words, you've flooded yourself and you know, and you're exhausted, but you've gotten to the other end of that whole display of emotion. And those therapies have been shown to work.
Therapy has to be offered at important times in their life. Now, it's really common for parents to come in and say, my child's been through this terrible trauma, please fix them, give them all the therapy they need so they never have to worry about this again. And we need to educate the parent that we're sorry, but that is not possible because that child, this is something that is part of their history, that is something that they will always have to find a way to deal with. And although we can help alleviate the symptoms that they're experiencing at that time, there will come a time when they need to revisit that experience and rethink about it, reprocess it, and then integrate it into their memories.
Working with the family to help them be supportive is sometimes indicated. Working with the authorities, because if the family is responsible for the kid's traumatic stress, you got to do something to break that up. And that's real messy because most of these kids love the people in their family. So it's a real double-edged sword of breaking families up versus keeping families together and changing their behavior. And if the behavior is never going to change, we'll break the family up, the kid's at risk. If the behavior is temporary, because maybe the parents are stressed out and you can relieve that, then maybe it's a better idea to keep the family together and because you don't want to double stress the kid.
We are a verbal animal. We put things into words. But when it comes to trauma, there are aspects of it that really don't do too well in words. And in fact, there's an odd word called alexithymia. That one's defined by Henry Crystal. And it has to do with an inability to put your emotions into words. Well, if you can't put some of these events into words, can you put them into drawings? Can you put them into drama? Can you put it into some nonverbal expression? Yes, you can. And it turns out that children, by and large, are rather remarkable at telling their stories in pictures and giving us a chance to view what their internal reality is. And it may be very, very different from what they have actually seen. They're not drawing portraits of perpetrators. They're beginning to tell what's inside their imagination. And that becomes a major tool that the child trauma therapist can use.
It's not always possible for a child to talk the way I'm talking, the way adults talk. But children can communicate in many, many ways. A very natural way of children communicating is through drawings.
We ask them to draw a picture of anything they want to and then to tell a story about it. And in that process, sometimes they reveal to us some of the things that are very relevant to them with regard to the traumatic experience. For example, the little girl who drew a deep, dark lake and she began to ink that lake in over and over again. She told me she was drawing a picture of a park that she liked to play in, and yet she was spending so much time darkening that lake. And when I looked at her and said to her, I bet there are things in that lake, deep in that lake, that nobody knows are there, she burst into tears and began to tell me how her mother had, friends of her mother and relatives of her mother had died traumatically, and she was now, since the traumatic experience had happened to her, very afraid that her mother would be killed. This was somebody who was not directly exposed to the traumatic event. So that she was communicating through that picture to me that there was something buried under that water, there was something there.
In this particular drawing, the child draws herself, her brother, her mother, and then, as you can see, the father is drawn as a black tornado. Although she had expressed to me her feelings about her father, he was an alcoholic, he was very verbally, physically, sexually, emotionally abusive to her. It was not completely possible for me to understand exactly how she felt. When a child expresses some feelings toward a parent, it's always complicated because they do have a loyalty often towards that parent. They do have some bonding towards that parent, even though that parent has been very abusive to them. So it becomes a very complex issue to discuss, and a therapist has to walk a careful line to avoid not appearing to take sides with that child, to avoid bringing up any loyalty conflicts that they may have as a result of that.
Those images become embedded in children's drawings, and the issues also become a part of their play following traumatic experiences. One little boy, a year after the sniper attack, set up on a carpet, a large carpet. He put schools here, there, all over. He made a little city of schools all over the carpet. And then he brought in helicopters, and he brought in police cars, and always there was some disaster happening at the schools, and yet he would bring in these policemen and rescue workers to stop them before anything bad happened.
You set up a scenario of, again, depending upon the relationship of a child, there's all kinds of configuration of toys that one can set up and have a child replay the incident with those dolls or trucks and weapons and whatever, and one way of processing what really happened. Sometimes I'm surprised at the kind of configuration of play that a child sets up, parts of it that I wasn't aware of because I hadn't been told. No one told me about a particular part of that, of what the tragedy had happened. Sometimes the child can't remember it either. But as he or she plays, the mind gives it up. The amnesia gives way to remembering. And so the child plays it out. Often can't put it into words because it's so painful still, but can behaviorally reenact what happened.
The little girl who had watched her father be stabbed, played over and over again in her sessions at disasters, and because the stabbing itself was so horrible to her, she started with other unrelated disasters and eventually worked her way up to the specific instances of violence. But always, before she got to that point, always in her play, something terrible would happen and then somebody would rescue. Somebody would come to the aid. And then finally, when she finished that set of her play, she began to have interpersonal violence in her play. And finally, one of the characters took the name of the cousin who had done the stabbing until she finally was able to actually depict in her play the incident.
I remember by 76, I saw a 4-year-old girl who had seen her mother stabbed to death. And, you know, I did like play therapy 101, you know, and I just, you know, well, let me just play with the kid and let her get used to me. Kid wouldn't talk at all. I mean, would not talk. And we'd play. And we played for, I guess, 3-4 months, you know, once a week. And I guess I was in a hurry to help her. So after this time, I would ask her from time to time about how she was feeling about this, you know, or I was expecting to see some traumatic play, and it never showed up, and she never would talk to me about it. And then I lost her because her grandmother took her who knows where. And you know, it's real hard to judge, was I moving too fast? Was I pushing? Or was I not pushing hard enough? Because a lot of times if you're in a poor clinic setting, you don't get real stable families sometimes, and they have to move around because of poverty and all kinds of problems. So it's almost like you feel this urge to get in and help it real quick and then get out. It's not like you have the luxury of having someone who's got a decent education, who's got a decent place to live, who's got decent health care, who's psychologically minded, who understands that this kid's been exposed to extreme stress and really needs to come to build a relationship so they can deal with their stress.
We also can look at children in the inner cities who are exposed on a regular basis to violence. I think that you have to know that there are some differences in response based on the nature of the trauma itself, based also on the phase of trauma. For example, the children that I interviewed in Croatia were in a very different phase of things than the children in Kuwait. The war was over in Kuwait. In Croatia, the war was still going on, and so the children were more focused on not the results of the war, but on coping with the ongoing war. And so that I think to some extent what you see with children in the inner cities is some of that sort of thing. It's the war's still on. There's not a closure. We're not responding to something that happened already and is finished, but are in the process of still dealing with coping with the ongoing war.
It's important to look at the problems of inner city children from a different perspective. The reason for that is because the threat to life and the stressors are so continuous. So we're talking about an environment of continuous stressors and threats to life. It's one thing when the threat happens, it's sudden and it goes away, and you can say, "Gee, I'm alive, and isn't it wonderful? I'm alive, and this may never happen again." But many children in the inner city have the sense that it will happen again. And perhaps next time, the catastrophe will be much worse than it was this time. And so that there is this anxious sense of being hyper-aroused and anticipating catastrophe. That makes it very hard for a child to relax and to pay attention to life, to wanting to live, to wanting to engage in things around growth and development and maturation, looking forward to a future, to growing up, being productive citizens, to loving and being loved. It's very, very difficult and often very impossible to do in some situations. I think the therapist needs to know himself or herself very well and know what the meaning of violence is to them. And certainly get in touch with the kind of stereotypes we see in the media about who commits all the violence and images and our feelings about that. And I think those are very important, because unless that's understood quite well, I think that there can be spillover into the treatment, which will adversely affect the relationship. And the child will pick up on that. It's kind of hard to be honest unless you know where you're coming from. Working with the inner city children, a lot of things come together. I mean, issues around ethnicity and race and culture, things about violence, poverty, and also about trauma. And trauma is still something that we can't talk about very much, regardless of who we are or where we come from. It's very hard to talk about trauma. The effects of an event, one single event that can change your life so radically and completely. That's very hard to talk about.
Right now, the country's trying to do something about violence. And I think we're somewhat confused. Because there's this move afoot to take a public health approach to violence prevention. And I think that's real useful because we did something about smoking. We've done a lot about car accidents. Smoking is behavior, drinking is behavior, violence is behavior. So it's clear you can change people's behavior to decrease a cause of death in society. If we can do something about smoking, do something about alcohol, certainly we can do something about violence. Problem is that we're confused. What we're confused about is predatory violence, which are career criminals that perpetrate predatory violence, versus interpersonal altercation relationship violence. The interpersonal altercation relationship violence is the one that is amenable to public health. The predatory violence is why they build prisons, and I'm glad that they do, because I think some people who are criminally violent need to be locked up. And yes, if we could get to them when they're 6 months old and they're being abused and abandoned and neglected by their families, maybe they wouldn't grow up to be predators. So there's even early intervention, prevention there. But after they're 30 and they're chronically, criminally, predatorily violent, put them in prison. Leave them there for a long, long time. Protect them. Protect me from them. On the other hand, you're talking about domestic violence. You're talking about kids who got bad tempers that fight. Let's identify, let's screen, let's treat them, let's debrief them about their own violence, let's teach them conflict resolution. And I think we can do something about that violence in society.
For some kids, medication would be used. It might be that PTSD happens along with other problems. It's a hyperactive child. The hyperactivity hasn't been diagnosed and it hasn't been treated. And the mind and body are fidgeting and working overtime. So there could be a combination of attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Children can get depressed. It's sometimes a more difficult diagnosis and treatment to work out with children, but children take antidepressants when they need them. And you want to be very cautious about getting a child started on a medication that affects the central nervous system. So it would be important to have a good assessment and discussion of the risks and benefits with the parent, and sometimes a trial to see how it occurs, and then getting on a general regime. I'm much more reluctant to use medication with children than with adults, but different doctors have different experiences and different feelings about that, and you certainly don't want to deny a child the chance to have their anxiety reduced, their depression lifted, and their sleep enhanced if all of these are impaired and they're missing out on school and friends and normal development.
We try to intervene sometimes with medication. I had a case of a kid who had been tortured by his stepfather. This guy would put this kid in a closet naked after beating him and leave him there for like 6 hours in the middle of the night. And this went on for years. Finally, they got found out. The kid went to the grandmother where he was warm, safe, he was protected, and the grandmother died after a year. And then he gets adopted or he goes to a foster home, and he's okay there. But now, because the kid is having nightmares every night, he's sleeping 2 hours. The reason the kid got to me is because he was fighting in school. They didn't bring him because he had had a traumatic stress, his grandmother died. That wasn't the chief. The chief, he's fighting in school. I wasn't real sure what fighting represented for him. Got the history. Found out he was sleeping 2 hours a night. I had to put him on medication, put him on an antidepressant, help him sleep, calm him down a little bit. He started getting 8 hours sleep a night. When he got 8 hours sleep a night, he would no longer go to school cranky and irritable. He stopped fighting. He stopped fighting. And he was accessible to treatment, to getting the nurturance from this new foster home. So medication is sometimes indicated.
The PTSD is very different from grief. And when they go together, often one has to get through the PTSD first, and then they grieve. And so you cure one thing, and then you start a long process of something else. It's a double dose of very, very difficult human adaptation, but it can be done.
When children have been exposed to a traumatic death, it is not as simple. It's not an uncomplicated bereavement anymore. And in fact, it's been found that a sudden unexpected death is associated with pathological bereavement. I think that with the interaction of trauma and grief, that what happens is a number of things. First of all, that when you're recovering from a grieving process, part of what you must do is think about the person who died, reminiscing, yearning for them. Those are all normal aspects of grieving. However, when there's been a traumatic death and you go to think about the person who died, you then find yourself thinking about the manner in which they died, so that now you're thrown into traumatic response. You're thinking of the horror of the death, the manner it happened, perhaps blood, mutilation, that sort of thing. So that we found that most often some amount of trauma work takes precedence over bereavement. Now, children are different. You really do have to, with trauma, move in the rhythm of the child. And some children will be able to talk about the traumatic, will need to do trauma work first, and then in the same session we'll be able to do some grief work. Other children may need to do several trauma sessions and then do some grief work and go back to trauma work. It's different with each child.
Many times, grief emerges in the treatment way down the road. Doesn't happen right away. And what covers up the grief is the anger and the hostility. That covers up the grief. When the relationship works well in therapy and a child is able to relax his defenses and able to feel better about his experience and feel that there's someone who listens and understands and who won't be judgmental, someone who can support the child in helping the child to recover. When that happens, then it becomes possible for the child to get in touch with grief. Grief is very, very painful, and it's something that is avoided at all costs in a child, and can only emerge after a good, solid relationship and trust has been established, and the child somehow gets a signal. Now it's time to get in touch with these depressive emotions. Now it's time, now it's okay to feel all the hurt and pain. But without doing that, the child can't move beyond where he or she might be. And quite often, a lot of kids you find in school who are aggressive and hostile with the weapons are kids who have not been able to grieve. And they've had a kind of impacted grief, kind of grief upon grief, never an opportunity of getting those emotions out.
It's almost like there are two threads that run through people. One thread is anxiety and stress and being flooded and overwhelmed. And another thread is loss, separation, death, depression. So you've got these two threads running, these two themes of human life. And what happens when there's a traumatic death, saw another kid who saw his father stab his mother 64 times. So he's dealing with the stress of that and the frenzy of his father stabbing his mother to death, and he's dealing with the loss of his mother. So he's got two themes running, an anxiety theme and a grief-depression theme. And the anxiety is interfering with his ability to process and mourn and introject. A patient once told me that the way she got over her grief was she learned to hold her mother in her heart. And as long as her mother was in her heart, her mother would always be alive in some way. Now, Freud calls that object representations, but I like her way better. And if every time you try to hold someone in your heart, that reminds you of the grisly way that they died, you try to get them out of there. So you never have them with you. without the reminder and the stress from the reminder. So it's hard. It's hard work.
People in the health professions and people in the police and other allied professions do have to be careful about their feelings when they're exposed to traumatized children. For some of us, it seems to be important to get back into the line of fire rather quickly. For others, it seems to be important to take a break. Burnout is used to describe relentless responsibility. And if you stay in the line of emotional fire too long, you can lose your concentration, you can lose your sense of humor, you can lose your desire to relax with somebody else. And then perhaps a supervisor or a colleague has to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, Frank, time for a vacation.
It's essential that people who work with trauma take good care of themselves, both for their own sakes and for the sake of the children. It's hard to do good trauma work when you've gotten to the point where you're so overwhelmed with the trauma or you're so inundated with trauma that you're going a little too fast sometimes, or not wanting to go to the deeper meaning of a specific issue of a traumatic moment for someone, that both you and the child are tired of the trauma and don't want to take it home with you anymore. And so you maybe terminate prematurely or don't address issues as thoroughly as is called for. So it's essential that a clinician especially working with trauma, take good care of themselves. And that's true with just basic things like eating well and exercising. I think when we're overwhelmed, we tend to stop to doing some of those basic things like eating right and getting exercise and doing recreational things that take good care of us. It's also essential when you're doing trauma work to do some of your own debriefing. Some cases especially, you need to talk out with other people, but it's important on a regular basis with trauma to have a chance to speak about those cases with a trusted colleague, to talk them out, and to have a chance to hear them out loud and to process them that way. It's important that you have a good support system as well when you're